How are we doing, Heather?
That looks perfect.
Okay. So, as noted, the every city has some difficulty in communication. The 25 years ago, there was a clear progression to the city council. As your experienced members know, you would start your service on the Civil Service Commission or the Planning Commission, go to city council meetings, and people moved into city council positions, usually with a firm basis or understanding of their role based on their community's experience. Sometimes the habits that were developed were good ones, sometimes not. As you know, that outline of how people become council members has changed considerably in recent days. In that interested citizen members often join a council to solve a problem, or in your case, and first time I've encountered it, you have a mayor who comes in a very unique way. So the challenges that the executive and city council have are common, and there are also some common sense tools to help you better your communications. The purpose of our program is to assist in developing and improving your relationship. And as you know, relationships are based on good communication. The better the communication, usually, the better the relationship works. And as noted, we're going to try and focus on the gray areas. I welcome questions as we move forward. I'll pause probably every 15 minutes and we'll, or at convenient places to take a break. And if you'd like, about halfway through, we can pause about an hour and 20 minutes into this. There's a good time to take a 5-minute break, and I'll ask. If you'd raise your hands physically, that'd be great when we get to the questions section. And as noted, I'm an attorney, so let's start with the standard disclaimer. These materials cover general statutory structures and some practical suggestions that have been developed with time and experience. Specific legal problems arise in specific situations, and they require individualized solutions. Please don't rely on these materials as a final answer in almost any situation. Consult your city attorney. And I appreciate the time that Sean's taken with me prior to the presentation. We've got some guiding principles that I think, and hopefully the structure will explain where the rubs come from. Cities exercise powers under the state constitution. That power flows through the state legislature to you. Your city is an optional code city, which means you have all powers that aren't specifically restricted, and you operate under an expansive code, but the structure of that code will determine what your roles are. Cities are classed in a variety of ways. As noted, you're an optional code city. And there are multiple forms of government. The two most common are mayor council, your form of government, sometimes called a strong mayor form of government, or a city manager form. There's some common characteristics. Your action has to be taken in a public forum. Transparency is a much overused word, but that should be and is the goal of most public agencies. Regular meetings are set by ordinance at an announced time and are conducted according to the rules of conduct that you establish. Most cities use Robert's rules as a basis, and then adopt their own specific rules of procedure or conduct that we'll come back to in a few minutes. Probably the main law that helps structure your communication is the Open Public Meetings Act. Special meetings are permitted. Your powers under the OPMA are to be exercised by a majority of the council in an open public meeting. And what that means practically is that you have a right to speak and vote as council members in accordance with your rules. But outside of a public meeting, you're an individual citizen. And for better or worse, your rights to information or inquiry are those of any citizen. Would noted, and one thing that I will discuss throughout the presentation is what I call the no surprise rule, though. And that is just the common sense direction that the executive needs to provide council members information in a timely manner so they're never surprised by something that comes up. And conversely, council members will be best served in getting information and communicating it with their peers if you provide notice ahead of time through the channels that have been established to gather that information. Just an aside, you may be wondering, why is the Washington City's Insurance Authority, our insurer, interested in this subject? And the short answer is when communications between mayors and councils, city managers and council members, staff and council break down, the citizens ends up paying, and often those the results are insured by the insurance company. So to the extent that we can help you improve your communications, your citizens and the taxpayers are better served, and the insurance company pays out less, and your rates are lower. Some of this, obviously, for you have a very experienced council. It's nothing that's going to surprise you. City councils adopt policy. You're setting the framework for the city's plan and government. And those ideas come to you in a variety of ways, from staff, community groups, advisory committees, chambers of commerce, in line at the grocery store often. You consider the merits of proposals and approve, modify, or reject them. In doing so, you analyze community needs, community program alternatives, and the available resources. One other, or the next major guiding principle, is that the budget and comprehensive plan elements are powerful policy tools that are adopted by ordinance. That seems obvious, but it has an important impact. And let's start with the budget system. There's enormous inertia built into the budget system. As a longtime city attorney, I've had the experience on many occasions to meet with, and you may recognize yourself here, mayor or council members, the brightly new elected council member who comes into office with a great idea. You're ready to do something, you're ready to roll. And then you encounter how difficult it is to turn the ship around, the sheer inertia of the budgeting system. If you have a fire department, 80% of your budget is salaries. 60% if you are in a fire district. Much of your budget is determined by multi-year collective bargaining agreements. So the amount of money that's at your discretion to spend in any budget year is relatively small. There are limits on revenue. I started practicing in the pre-Tim Eyman years. Things are much different now. There was a time 30 years ago when half or more of city budgets came from federal and state funding. That money's disappeared as those agencies or those entities have kept the monies for themselves to deal with their problems. In addition to the limits on revenue, as council members, you know that long-term planning ensures that many of your major projects are planned 6 years in advance. This is a function of the Growth Management Act that requires that the expenditure of funds be consistent with your comprehensive plan. You've had the experience, I'm sure, at the end of the year in those extended budget sessions as you're talking about matters of really vital importance to the citizens. And you'll have the public hearing on the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Plan, or your capital facilities or capital improvements plan, and nobody shows up to speak, or somebody has a comment about one traffic roundabout. Those processes control your spending for a 6-year period, and they're really vital. I noted the lack of public comment. You probably also had the experience that when that sign goes up on First Avenue that it's about to be curbed and reguttered and the street will be closed for the next 6 weeks, then the citizens come in under public comment to complain. To the extent that you can get comments from your citizens in the transportation and capital improvement planning process, that's when they have the most good. Again, 6-year documents, they're key to successful grantsmanship. Under the GMA, every city is required to have a public involvement plan, and to the extent that you as council members can be aware of what that plan is and encourage citizens to participate, the better information you have and the better input they have. Why don't we pause before we get into complaints? Any comments or questions about just sort of those rough basics and the inertia of the system? Okay. Next place that friction sometimes arises is responding to citizen complaints. I've found over my career that the area of government that is most responsive to community concerns is the city council, local government. You see your citizens on a daily basis. They know you. They know your home phone number. They know where to find you. And as I said, you're out in the community, or more so, not less so the last year, but usually you're at the store or Costco or wherever, and people hit you up with concerns or comments. They know where to go. So what do? Keep in mind that outside of the council context, that is outside of your vote in a majority of the council, you have no authority to direct or bind the city. Be very careful not to bind the city by your comments. Telling a citizen how you see things, what your position is great and absolutely necessary, part of your job. But appearing to promise or giving assurances that something will happen as an individual council member are simply beyond your authority. A council member, what do? You can refer the concern to an appropriate staff member, and we'll discuss in a few minutes how cities typically channel information. You can raise the issue at a city council meeting, and we'll talk about this several times during the course of the morning, but adhering to your council policy, doing things through a majority of the council's action ensures that you stay within your budget. When council members have the ability to affect staff priorities, in effect, it changes the priorities that you as a council of the whole have already set in the budget process. You can discuss complaints against public officials in executive session. You can discuss them in public, but I'm sure the insurance authority would, and your city attorney would always caution you, bring matters up that may have liability concerns in an executive session context. Executive sessions, you're familiar with them. Probably have not encountered a matter of national security, but that's very important for public agencies that run airports, the acquisition of real estate. I'm sure you're familiar with this list. Negotiating publicly bid contracts, and that's important point. There are certain types of contracts that are not bid. If they're not bid, you can't discuss them in executive session, because the purpose of the executive session is to avoid a negotiating problem for the city. If the information getting out isn't going to hurt the process, then no reason why it shouldn't be public. You can receive and evaluate complaints or charges against public officials. You can evaluate the qualifications of applicants or review public employee performance in executive session. As we'll discuss, the direction, discipline, hiring, and discharge of employees is in the mayor's toolkit, not yours, but you do have opportunities for input or to pass information along. Similarly, to evaluate candidates for appointment, and to discuss with legal counsel pending litigation or enforcement actions. This is one section that has been expanded in recent legislative terms. Used to be, well, I think the problem became that city councils occasionally thought that simply having your city attorney or an attorney present gave the ability to discuss almost any darn thing. And accordingly, the legislature had been really tying that down to pending litigation or actions that could lead to litigation. Labor negotiation. The council has a variety of input. One important aspect of the OPMA is to understand that meetings to discuss your labor negotiation strategy isn't a meeting under the OPMA. So many of the normal requirements that restrict executive sessions, for example, saying when you're going to end the session and having to go out and tell the public it's going to be extended, don't apply to strategies, developing strategy for labor negotiations. Got a bit more freedom. The Public Employment Relations Commission had an interesting case in 2019 involving Benton and Franklin County. It pointed out that negotiations sessions themselves can only be open to the public with the agreement of both parties, and that it's a permissive subject of bargaining. That means that both sides must agree to bargain it and open the negotiating session, and the default is that the sessions are closed. I'm sure you're familiar with special meetings. They can be called by the mayor or a majority of city council members. You can see the rub, since the majority of council members can only act in an open public meeting. It means if the council wants to call a session, they need to do it ahead of time at a public meeting. The mayor, at the request of council members or staff, can call a meeting himself. 24 hours written notice, and the action items are limited to those listed in the notice. It doesn't mean, for example, that a council can't, you can't have comments about things you'd like to see or the upcoming street fair, but your action items are limited to the notice. So what's a meeting? A meeting is, and this is a bit circular, so bear with me. A meeting is a meeting at which action is taken. And action is defined in the statute as very broadly as the transaction of public business. Business can be transacted by the receipt of public testimony, deliberations, review, and this is one of the squishy ones, reviewing something. Had a discussion with a special purpose district chair yesterday, and he and one of the other members, the 3-member group, wanted to go down and walk along their drainage way beach with us, the engineer. And, we're wondering, how do you do that within the OPMA? And the short answer is you give notice of a special meeting and let public wants to come along and walk the beach with you, walk. Evaluations of public business or issues. Final action, which is where the focus tends to be, is a collective decision or actual vote, meaning a meeting of the minds in a serial meeting or rolling quorum situation. That is where council members by telephone or email communicate with each other, either as a group or sequentially, can be a collective decision. That's probably the area where there's the most potential liability and problems for cities. And frankly, again, I started practicing municipal law at a time when the best discussions were at the local bar after the council meeting ended. Everybody had a stool and you continued the discussion of public business. But under the OPMA, that will not do. Kudos to your city. Sean's mentioned your establishment of rules regarding ad hoc and other council committees. An excellent start. As I mentioned, one of the real tasks for council members, some of the discussions leading up indicate that we've got a lot of talkers on the Zoom today, is to avoid the serial meetings and those violations that I just mentioned. And the purpose of this is to establish a clear public record, which leads to that transparency goal. Questions, comments? And I'd appreciate, since I can only see so many of you at one time, anyone have anything they'd like to get in? Okay, moving right along. More guiding principles. Cities, and this is real important, particularly in today's world, you have to follow the statutes, ordinances, and resolutions until the council acts to amend them. This seems obvious, but it's the major source for council authority to be sure that the path you set for the city is followed. The city councils have only those powers that we stated that you are specifically granted by statute, and the public's work must be done in public. Revenues and expenditures are strictly regulated. I mentioned, the limitation on revenue that's occurred over the past 20 years in our state. The rules on what's a tax and what's a fee are well established by case law. You have very limited taxing authority. A fee is a charge that's based on providing a service. The classic Washington case involves streetlights in the city of Seattle. It's not something street lighting charges aren't something you tuck into a power bill. That was ruled to be an illegal tax. You can establish fees for service based on the cost of providing service. The other principle that I'm sure you've run into is the gift of public funds. Cities must receive value for the expenditure of funds that you put forward. those expenditures have to conform to your budget. And let's be clear, the city council in this case is always the 800-pound gorilla. Your budgetary power is your major tool to both set policy and to determine how it's expended. You do that on an annual basis. It is your major tool, and it's why mayors and city managers need to follow that basic principle of no surprises. They must work within the budget that you establish. The mayor may move funds around within the funds, that is the general fund or the utility fund, subject to limitations that you establish. We'll drill down on this later in our discussion. And again, I hope you get involved at that point. Where you set the limits, you need to be practical and allow scope for the city to be nimble in these troubled times. As a code city, you're granted to write and adopt your own rules of process and procedure. Again, the city council meeting is your workplace. It's where you get things done. And it is very important that you control that environment. Follow your rules. You have a resolution 20-05 that establishes those rules, and as council members, know and understand them. And also appreciate that the chair of the meeting, the mayor, is responsible to enforce your rules. If you don't like the mayor's decisions, change the rules, or if your rules allow, suspend them for a specific issue. But understand that the mayor, by enforcing those rules on anything from public comment to which council member speaks next, is enforcing your rules. Back him up. Public works projects typically require a public bidding process. The construction industry has a great lobby in Olympia, as do organized labor. So much of the public bidding process for large construction processes focus on things like prevailing wages. It's a very complex and I would say rigid, but precise process. Small works rosters can be adopted to allow you to use simplified bidding procedures from standard state rosters, cuts down on staff time and ensures you get the same deal as other communities. Prevailing wages, I mentioned, are required to be paid. Cities have a limited ability to use volunteers. Like the old bandstand that the Elks or Rotary wants to rebuild. You can do that within very specific limits annually. There are collective bargaining issues involved and public works limitations. So while you have that ability to understand what the limits are, work with your city attorney, please. This may seem obvious. Again, I'm speaking, coming to you through the sponsorship of your city's insurance authority. But council members have a limited immunity from tort liability as you exercise your functions. You have to act in good faith. The actions that you take have to be objectively, legally reasonable. And if you're within those limits, liability insurance is provided by the municipality, and you have indemnity, the right to have the city pay for your defense and any damages that are incurred, as long as you're within the scope of your authority. Before we get to this next section, which is one of those where the action is. Any comments, questions?
Yes, Scott, I do. Steve Hogan. The council, my understanding is that the council has the ability to control the agendas for the meetings, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so would you recommend, under those circumstances, I guess it's a technical question, but if the council had on the agenda each meeting a question that the mayor would ask regarding, is there a need for special meetings? Wouldn't that be a way to check off at each meeting whether you could legally have a quorum to call another meeting? You following what I'm saying, Scott?
I do. I'm not sure that would solve the problem. Again, special meetings are relatively rare. If you call them too often, the public gets a little squishy about that, as I'm sure you're aware.
Yeah.
And a council member can request a special meeting by motion at any time at any meeting.
Okay, there you go. Thanks.
And let's get back to your agenda point, because and just talk about improving communications and tools that city use. And thank you very much, by the way, for being bold enough to break the ice. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Setting agendas frequently are done by the mayor, city manager. Many cities do it with the input of the council president or mayor pro tem, so that you have council involvement. Input through the city administrator is crucial. Council members should have a path to contact the administration prior to the meeting and make sure things get on the agenda. Then, as a practical matter, at a regular meeting, you can take up any darn thing you want. So if something comes up, a council member can move, and it's an important and early part of your agenda, the approval of the agenda. So if you have a new item or something's come up, you can ask to have that placed on the agenda. Again, and if a majority of your council agrees with you, they have that done. So your question was a good one, and it's really indicative of that gray area where the roles take place. It's the council's agenda, the council meeting, but because you can only meet, you either have to set it at your last meeting or rely on that communication through the city administrator and the mayor to get that item on the agenda. As I said, you could follow that path, or again, that the role of the council president, mayor pro tem, is something that you can establish and work with. But again, it's that give and take and making sure that there are no surprises. I think they're a key there.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Anything else?
That's it for me.
Okay. So we're about to get into what to me is one of the more interesting areas, and it's one where, frankly, a lot of the friction occurs in communities. And that's, let's look at the city manager form of government, because they've got a very clear statute. Neither the council nor any of its members or committees can direct anybody to be hired or removed from office, except for the purposes of inquiry. Council members have to deal with the administrative service solely through the manager, and you have no right to give orders to any city employee. The statute concludes with common sense provision. It doesn't prohibit you in open session from fully discussing with the city manager matters relating to the appointments of officers or city affairs. And as we've discussed, that can and should often be an executive session if it deals with a personnel issue that could result in liability to the city, or potentially remembering that a complaint or is an allegation, the defamation of a public servant, be very careful. The city council, a strong mayor form of government, there's no similar statute, but the powers of the city council are the same in the city manager statute as they are in the statute that relates to strong mayor forms of government. Commonly, mayors direct staff to respond through a process. It is your city. There will be a process, and I'm going to look to Jamal or the mayor to, and in a minute, to explain what your process is. But the direction of council to certain mechanisms for gathering information, you can always make a motion and at a council meeting, and if 4 of your council members or 3, sorry, the majority of your council agrees, you can direct an action in between or to gather information, because you as council need information in order to make reasoned decisions. There should be, and usually is, some pathway. Going outside of that pathway can have a budget impact. You're annually, and I spent probably more time than you needed going through the inertia of the budget system. That's just a fact. But once you've established budget priorities, you know, directing, if individual council members had the ability to direct staff to do things, think of it as basically busting your own budget. You as a group have lost the ability to control that direction. You can do so as noted by a motion of the council. The other issue is often in cities, long-serving council members and with long-serving department heads will have relationships that have developed. You have ways of getting information, people to pick up the phone. If you go too far down the organizational chart, there are significant power imbalance issues. You may come to an employee or ask them for information, and they simply don't feel comfortable saying no to a council member. Understand that you may be putting that city employee in a very difficult situation if he's violating the direction of the mayor or city administrator. If I could, Mr. Fox, Mayor, would you mind just reminding me and the council of what your direction is in terms of how staff members are to respond, or what the route is for council members to get information from staff?
Jamal, you want to answer that one?
Yes, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Mayor. For council members to get information from staff, council members have several different options. One, in their committees that they sit on, like the finance committee, there's conversation that council is able to ask and request, and follow-up is done through that committee, or similar to the JPAC, dealing with fire issues and our partnerships there. Very broadly, council members, if they have questions for members of staff, they can reach out to the mayor or myself, and we will follow up with the department heads and make sure that we respond back to council members with the responses that are appropriate. And we've set that direction and process early on. Since we set that process, council members have, and in conversations with the mayor or I, have reached out to department heads and for various responses, and department heads have responded back to council and copied the mayor and I. So we're in the loop and we know what's going on.
You just hit on an excellent point. And then my no surprise rule is always number 1 on my practical suggestions. Number 2 is ensuring that all council members get the same information at or about the same time. Nothing breeds communication problems like thinking there are favorites. If I might look to the council, how's it working for you? Are there strong or weak points in the system for you? And if I could, I'd like to start with Councilmember Burton, who I've had the opportunity to speak with, and then any other council member. Again, how's the current structure? Do you understand it? Is it working for you?
I think it was, okay, I'm going to be honest. It was a big surprise. It was a big surprise because, as you heard from our initial introductions, some council members have been on the council for over 20 years and are used to working one way or in a group of ways. There were set norms. And anytime you have new people come in, those norms can change. In my experience, it's extremely important to have a purposeful conversation about norms and why they need to change, to make sure that there's a context and alignment on the situation, what the positives are, what the negatives are, and how we can improve those. And for me, that didn't occur. So this was a big change. It was like jibing the boat. I love to use sailboat analogies. All of a sudden we were going down this tack and we jibed the boat and none of us were ready. What would have been more helpful was to have a conversation so we can understand why this change is made. You make a great point. If I contact new hire Sophie and ask her a question about what's happening at a particular stormwater depository, that's a problem. So some of that was, my understanding, happening. And so it was important to set some boundaries and raise that up. And also, as you pointed out, it's extremely important that the mayor and our city administrator know what's happening because they don't want to be blindsided. That's fair. That communication is really important. One of the things that I'm not sure is happening, and it would be worthwhile to have a conversation, is are we getting the information at the same time? So for example, if I email Jamal with a specific question, he gets back to me with an answer. That's good. I have the information. What I don't know, does Bonnie need it? Does Steve need it? Because they may be having that conversation in the Costco line and becoming away as, I'm not sure what to tell this individual. So that's where we need the information in the same way, because if one of us have the question, probably one other one is getting an email too. So for me, context is really important, having purposeful conversations about what's driving a potential for a change, and then getting alignment on what are the best ways to address it. Because we all have different styles of working, and there's many ways to solve the same problem. We got to get the best one that'll drive the right outcomes for our community, our citizens, and our budget.
Excellent. You know, you raised something that obviously you'll as a group need to deal with. I'd like just to address one of the specifics. Again, it's the city attorney hackles raising. And that's the reply all function. You know, making sure that Mr. Fox can communicate information to each and every council member, get it relatively at the same time. Again, somebody's going to ask the question and get the response, making sure that all council members are comfortable that they're getting the same information. As you know, you can communicate with the city administrator can communicate with you. It's that reply all function that gives rise to the serial meeting or the rolling quorum that you need to be careful about.
I have a question. This is Bonnie Carter. So never used it, but it occurred to me, the reply all issue has us all very aware and cognizant of an email that comes through. What about the blind carbon copy option? Is that an option for us? Or is that really not transparent enough who is receiving that communication, even if we state it at the beginning of an email? Just curious.
Well, again, I'm not sure what it would solve. Copying everyone. Remember, any communication, whether you BC or CC, it's going to be a public record. So I guess my reaction, and this is again, it's your relationship, you need to build it. But my reaction would be CC, you could have a city council group and just make sure that, again, Mr. Fox can communicate with all council members.
Okay.
You just can't communicate with each other.
I guess my thought on that was it eliminates the option to reply all. If you BCC, you can't reply to the whole group. You can only reply to the sender. So that's why I brought it up.
Well, thank you. And as you saw when I was trying to load my slide, I'm not the technical expert. Talk to Heather. Another mechanism, again, that relatively the same time, would be to collect those things that arise between council meetings and include them as a part of packet distribution. You have an excellent staff. I'm sure you guys can work out ways to pass that information along. Ms. Burton, I saw you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a kudo. One of the things that I have really liked that Jamal has implemented since he's come on board is on Friday, he sends us a newsletter, if you will, that gives us a review of what the upcoming meetings are, whether it's planning commission or parks or council meetings. It gives us a list of some of the issues or topics the city staff are working on. And then it gives us some updates from the county or region and also just a little more detail. And for me, that's been really, really helpful. And I can then take that information and craft it into a response to a constituent or just use that in my analysis of other topics we have in council. So that's been a very positive change that I like very much.
Good. One of the things that I find foster citizens' belief in your system and in the city is that idea that you're working together and you're on the same page. So as Ms. Burton mentioned, and good job, Mr. Fox, that if you can provide a common response, if your citizens believe you're all on the same page, adds a great deal of confidence to your work product. Before we move on, any other council members want to get in on that?
Scott, this is Greg.
Yes, sir.
I wanted to echo some aspects of Ellen's 2 comment sessions. As a longtime council member working with multiple mayors and multiple city administrators, and one of the things that works is having a relationship with the department heads outside the public meeting forums. And in some cases, even though we may be on committees, we sometimes don't meet often. And certainly with the Zoom and pandemic we're in right now, you still don't develop a relationship with a department head, whether they're a long time or relatively recent. So using the committee process is good if there's regular committee meetings to raise questions and work through concerns or questions. So I'm hoping there's a middle ground for bringing concerns forward that may not normally rise to a city manager, city mayor level of concern. It's just one of these, hey, I remember when we used to do it this way and now we're doing it that way. And I don't want to be perceived as criticizing, but I'm curious as to why did we make a change, for example. Secondly, when a citizen reaches out to us as a group of council members, which includes the mayor, and there's an expectation that one or more of us will answer, and leaving out the reply all in an answer leaves the other members of council not knowing whether it's been answered And sometimes in the past, we've communicated with a citizen with differing answers. One council member's perspective is different than another, yet we both replied to the same email. And we, in some cases, don't know that a city staff person or the mayor has responded either. So so sometimes you don't reply all, you don't reply to anything because you don't want to be wrong. So it leaves a black hole for the citizens who, so to speak, pay our salaries. And that bothers me. So it's a hairball I'm presenting to you. I don't think there's an instant best solution, but it's the conflicts of sudden changes in communication processes affected probably me the most, I'm going to suggest, only because as a council member, I've been the longest. Don, I'm a longtime staff member prior to being a council member. I'm not going to speak for him in that regard, but it gets in our way of us doing our representational role with the citizenry. And it's probably more of a speech than a question, sorry.
Well, I'll tell you what, let me say the hard fact here. And that is that the structure that's been established let me back up. My take, and I appreciate the time I spent with Mr. Fox and Ms. Burton ahead of time, is that things have been tightened down to be similar to the kind of communication expected in most communities in your state. That sounds like council members had far greater access to staff than is typical, and that's not unusual where you have long-serving council members. So the rules have been changed a bit. Finding ways to communicate within that structure is going to be your challenge. You mentioned, Councilmember Anderson, that communicating with the citizens, and I think that's one of the things you need to be very careful about, is not appearing to bind the city. If there's an answer, I'd suggest you route that concern through the city administrator. And then when the staff member responds, the staff member copies you. Have a process so that it's clear, but you need to be very careful. You mentioned you or other council members giving different responses. If it's your opinion on an upcoming legislative matter, should we have, what are the sort of things that bring the most members of the public to public comments? A cat leash law. You mentioned cats, chickens, dogs, that will get everybody out into the council meeting. That's the sort of issue where you can talk to citizens, you have your comment, your position. But if this has to do with the administration of a contract or a personnel matter, you need to route that through the city administrator to the appropriate, so that it stays within the executive structure. It's fair for council members to want to know when that response goes out and what that response is. But your role is to communicate the concern. It's administration's role to respond, and then to make sure that you know what that response was. Again, my bully pulpit here. Ms. Burton?
I think in thinking about the organizational work that I've done previously in my career, one of the things that could really help here is if we, and I'm proposing potential solution, had a small committee work on some rules of engagement and identifying a few of these key processes and being very clear on the role, accountability, who's consulted and whom's informed. And just, it might be 3 processes, and then get the input and then get a viable solution and communicate it out to all of us, administration, staff, and council. So the process that you just outlined, that's simple. It's like 3 steps, can be efficient and effective, and we could all buy into it. Because what I'm hearing from the council is we don't know if someone responded, we don't know what the response is. So next time we're at Costco and get asked, we want to give accurate information, and we also want to be responsive to our constituents. We represent them. And that's very, very important to each one of us. So I think that if we could have a conversation, and it could be a committee working on us on being clear about operating rules for the council and administration, that would eliminate a lot of the stumbling blocks.
Okay, well, let's put that on your to-do list. I appreciate the council members' input. This is always one that will get you moving, and thank you all for being frank. Moving right along here. Policymaking and implementation roles. The mayor, again, keeps, and what, by the way, when I say mayor, I'm talking about the mayor, city administrator, and executive. But the executive's function is to keep the council informed. And that's just the points that the council members were making. The mayor proposes policy and then implements the policy that the council's adopted. Again, and you adopted either through the exercise of police powers by adopting ordinances, but most importantly, by your budget priorities. And then again, this is the key role that we just were discussing, is report back to council regarding policy implementation and possible improvements. When I do this presentation occasionally with the senior consultants from the City Managers Association, we have a big flow chart that they use to sort of show the circular nature of decision making. Council, this is what we were just talking about. You listen to your residents, you keep track of their concerns and wishes. You develop policies that guide your government and the aspects of city operations, and you make broad-based policy decisions. You can see that area in between these two roles is what we were discussing. That gray area is what makes it in life interesting, and it's what you need to work out, because each of you has both a role and a responsibility, whether it's the no surprise rule or getting the same information in a timely fashion. I'll mention this because I think it's important to understand that a city administrator is not a city manager. The city administrator speaks for the mayor, and he exercises the powers that the mayor is given by statute. As council members, you need to respect that that is Mr. Fox's role, that he needs to channel the mayor's directives and policies. This is one of the places I think this is most important, is to understand that the city administrator serves at the pleasure of the mayor, and by following his direction fulfills the mayor's agenda. Where this often comes up, unlike a city administrator who has a full statutory kit of powers and is protected from council interference by statute. By the way, council members and a city manager form of government who attempt to interfere with administration can be removed from office. But the city manager is appointed and can be removed by an action of the city council. The city administrator, on the other hand, can only be removed from the mayor. One word of caution and advice, if you will, is we'll talk about the confirmation process. I'd suggest, as you choose, and hopefully you did, and hopefully you won't be choosing a new city administrator in the near future, Mr. Fox, that if and when you choose, is give enormous deference to the mayor, understanding that hiring a city administrator who does not follow the mayor's direction is asking for the mayor to cut him or her off from their powers. To refuse to work with them is an enormous waste of public money. So appreciate that your city administrator is speaking for the mayor, and that needs to be responsive to the mayor's direction. Mr. Fox, have I stated that fairly? Okay. Labor and personnel. This is, again, the mayor hires and fires. but he does it subject to a variety of constraints and realities. Civil service system for fire and police is a tool. Collective bargaining agreements. A lot of the BLM discussions have centered around the importance or the primacy of collective bargaining agreements in the disciplinary process. So that there are often due process requirements for union employees and a complicated procedure. Council, you need to appreciate that. Mayor has to operate within the budget. I'll mention this again later, but I think it's important that if the council exercises budgetary authority, you do so with an understanding that the city needs to be nimble. Here's my example. Working with the city whose budget had gotten to the level of detail that it provided that there were to be 3 maintenance worker 2s and 2 maintenance worker 1s, and the mayor wanted to hire 3 maintenance worker 1s and save some money. But because the city's budget had gotten down to the level of detail and restricted hiring to that process, the more money was wasted in staff time and meeting time than was saved by changing. The mayor just wanted to hire 3 new entry-level employees rather than 3 top-level employees. By the time it got sorted out, any savings were long lost. So, be aware that the more detail you get into, the more difficulty can be caused. Let me back up. Council confirmation can be required for positions. One of the things I see working with cities around the state, one of the common, I won't say mistakes, but common divergences from the statute is that councils sometimes get into establishing job descriptions and requiring confirmation. If you read the statute, the idea of a confirmation process is for either top-level employees, like a police chief, for example, where the duties are typically not, really bound by a job description, but are set out by statute. The purpose of the statute is for councils to exercise their authority either by having a detailed job description or having a confirmation process. When you do both, it's getting into a level of detail that I think is counterproductive to being nimble or responsive. The mayor directs, the executive directs, employees within the budget according to job descriptions and ordinance structures. There are certain things that you do, and because they're set out. Building official is easy, administers the state building code. Council, I would imagine that a communications director has a much more challenging job on his plate. The city council, you can create a civil service system. There is one provided by the state. As long as you stay within the general guidelines, the city can make changes to its civil service system. You direct negotiation and approve all collective bargaining agreements and any individual employment contracts. By all means, use closed sessions to develop that negotiating authority. We'll come back to this later regarding the role in setting negotiating parameters, but the basic idea is to make sure that the council is consulted at the start, sets broad-based negotiating parameters that can be in terms of dollar authority. But what you want to avoid is an unfair labor practice for bad faith bargaining. Again, we'll go into that in a little more detail in a minute. The council approves budget which includes an annual salary ordinance or portion of the budget that sets out salaries and benefits. And again, you can establish departments, positions, job descriptions. Note that the overlap here between the budget and collective bargaining agreements, the approval of a collective bargaining agreement for most cities is going to restrict the exercise of authority in other areas. And, you know, again, there's just a certain inertia built into your system. What I'm getting at is it's really difficult to make massive changes in units represented by unions because you've got a duty to negotiate those changes or in terms and conditions of employment. We've been at this a little over an hour. Would you like to take a break or shall I press on? Mayor, what's your direction?
Bonnie, I see your hand up. You want to take a 5-minute break? Let's take a 5-minute break, if that's all right with you, Scott.
That is absolutely all right. I'd love to get a cup of coffee. See you at 5. Thank you, Heather. Now we're into the budget, which is where the council swings the hammer. It's the real basis for your majority of your authority. As you know, the executive prepares and presents a preliminary budget. Cities do it in a variety of ways, from zero-based budgeting to building on the work you've done in the past. As I noted earlier, it's important to understand for new council members and the public at large that the majority of the work the council does has to honor both past contracts with employees, public works contracts, and that TIP and CFP plans. The staff prepares budget estimates and that honor before the October's first business date and honor before the budget is presented to the city council with a budget message. Cities do this in a variety of ways. Some get council input early. Some stick with the state schedule. Some use committees to facilitate it. Again, no surprises, same information, always the best policy. The city council holds budget hearings, adopts the budget. You establish tax rates and fee schedules. You set salaries and benefits. Because that's mostly within collective bargaining agreement limitations, your annual salary ordinance typically affects non-represented and management employees the most. But if you have other benefits, again, they should be approved by the council in that setting. The council may establish limits on interfund transfers. Intra-fund in this case means within the general fund or utility funds. It's a very broad-based structure. Councils use contingency funds to provide for emergencies and the future. Many are operating on those contingency funds at the moment. The contingency funds, there are percentages established by broad national guidelines, and they should include, when you consider what appropriate contingency funds, be aware that things like depreciation funds and other things built into the budget are all part of your contingency planning. The mayor administers the budget, spends the money. As noted, you can make interfund transfers unless specifically limited by ordinance. That's power that the council has. That's where the trust relationship between the mayor and council are important. You want to have a level of trust that make sure that you don't have unnecessary restrictions, but if the council desires necessary restrictions, where that line isn't clear, and it has to do with your trust relationship. Mayor requests authorization for amendments. We all know stuff happens during the course of the year, last year being a prime example. Projects will go awry, new things will come up. Having flexibility is necessary to meet reality. The city council amends the budget. There's a simplified process for wages, hours, and conditions of employment that can be done at any time by a majority of the council. Mid-biennial adjustments can be done by a majority of the council, and amendments to the budget require a supermajority, majority plus one, to decrease, revoke expenditures, or reappropriate money. The statute implies that it's for emergencies, foreseeable and unforeseeable. As a practical matter, during the course of the year, most councils and administrations develop processes to keep council appraised of how you're doing in certain areas, overtime budgets, new projects, things that have come up, get council approval and understanding, so that when it's time to amend the budget mid-year or year-end, that you do so, that it should be perfunctory, that the council has already been involved in the very changes that require that budget amendment, pre-approval, if you will. Councilmember Anderson mentioned your committee structure, a good process to communicate the changes as they occur. Land use and planning. I again, many years of city attorneying here. The one thing that I think we'd all agree is that the thing that most citizens are most afraid of is change. And the one thing that we can count on in life is change. There's a constant movement, and often it shows up in land use and planning. The mayor supervises the planning staff, who make recommendations to the planning commission and city council for changes. And the council or the staff enforces building codes and other development regulations, supervises the permitting process. Before we move on, though, one of the things that I've seen this come up a number of times, any number of times, I'm sure you're aware, that often the public becomes involved in planning issues at a date when it's too late to do something. We'll look at some examples in our discussion problems, but often that I'm thinking about that major piece of undeveloped property in the middle of the neighborhood is seen as a neighborhood amenity until it becomes developed as a mega church or halfway house, something else that may be within proper zoning. Under the Growth Management Act and the planning process, that's a multi-year process. Getting citizens involved early in the process is important, with the understanding that once the rules are set, developers and property owners have every right to exercise their rights. Again, plan ahead, think ahead. Yes, ma'am, Ms. Burton. Muted?
Yeah. Okay, unmute. Thank you. I wanted to bring us back to the budget for a moment. So during this conversation this morning, I've heard you emphasize numerous times the importance of the budget. That in other conversations I've been in recently, it's been called the moral compass of the community. It shows these actual strategies that oftentimes things may be stated, but when you see them funded, it tells us where the city's priorities and strategies are. It's a check and balance mechanism. And you pointed out how with council, sometimes they could actually distract staff from executing on the budget and perhaps drive costs by bringing incremental issues or considerations. So my question is, excuse me, the budget is presented by the mayor. There's a statutory process. You mentioned in some cases, cities start earlier than November. And fortunately, our excellent city director of budgeting and finance does do that. So we have a chance to get an input. One of the things I have experienced in organizations in the past is we have a clock here. There is a statutory requirement that we have to be finished by a certain day. How do we set up an efficient and effective process to drive the right outcome, which is a budget that is reflecting the moral compass of the city, reflecting the strategic priorities, and it just doesn't become something that is running out of the clock? How do we make sure that those priorities of the community and the council get into that budget?
Okay, good question. Let me go back to something I mentioned before. It's both the problem, the inertia of the budget, but also it's how it can be a proper planning tool. Remembering that 60 to 80% of your budget is salaries. So that leaves us with 20 to 40%. The majority of the remaining money is spent in accordance with the capital facilities plan and transportation improvement plan, which are 6-year documents. So ideally, and by the way, this is where contingency funds come in. Contingencies are for emergencies and things that come up. But the majority of that additional money should be planned on a 6-year process. Again, one of the most underutilized tools I see in city government is effective use of the TIP and the CIP-CFP, because that is where, I mean, your citizens really should be directed. If you need a new swimming pool or community center, if you have a major arterial or problem neighborhood streets, understand that under the Growth Management Act, you should have a public comment or plan in place. Your citizens should be directed to those hearings, which are part of the budget process, because they focus not just on the next year's spending, but on what your priorities will be over the next 6 years. So while you have a 2 or 3 month budget process, that process also informs your processes for the next 6 years. They also are where you're setting your priorities for grantsmanship and the opportunities that may come up. I hope that's helpful, because if we take what's in the TIP, what's in your CFP and your salaries, the actual amount of money that's left over is very small. And typically, again, that's where use of your contingency funds comes in. Is that helpful, council member?
Yes, I'm thinking what could be helpful. And as an aside, our strategic plan, we're rotating back into the strategic planning. Well, the strategic planning process should be continuous. We're rotating back into a review of that plan. So it seems to me that if we actually implement a working strategic planning process that's continuous, where there's reviews and tweaks, then that budget reflects that strategic planning process and the priorities that the citizens are setting. So we should be able to make sure we stay within those guidelines. And per your point, you got to be flexible. And The city also manages contingency funds very, very tightly. We're very conservative there. Okay, okay.
My only comment about a strategic planning process is that will be helpful for the, but again, needs to culminate in the adoption of your TIP and CFP. Because again, those are your major public projects and spending. And just a suggestion as somebody who's sat through tens of thousands of public meeting hours, as many of you council members no doubt have, is not to double up. Strategic planning may be the council's a good tool for the council, but your citizens need to be on the record and use the TIP, the CFP, and your comprehensive plan processes to get their input in, which is a good segue back to planning here. That public participation plan is important. There is both growth planning board and judicial review of spending. It needs to be in line with what has been adopted. Hopefully you use, and I take a head nod, to use a hearing examiner system for most of your land use appeals, I assume. The council, of course, has that primary role in adopting area-wide zoning. That is your final and most important planning tool in terms of land use. Day-to-day activities, again, this is obvious. The mayor supervises through the city administrator the day-to-day affairs of the city within the budget, enforces ordinance through police and code enforcement. The mayor administers contracts and requests approval for civil litigation to enforce contract provisions. The council has to approve civil litigation and direct it. The city council can create that administrative structure. That is, again, you have the broad brush, and the mayor and city administrator handle the fine detail. You create that structure through the budget process, through what's called police powers, which are health, safety, and welfare ordinances. You provide for contract approval by the council and to assure that it's administered within the parameters that you set. The mayor signs contracts after you approve them and supervises contract performance. This is one of those no surprise areas. When things go wrong, the public works director through the city administrator and mayor should be letting the council know, because things do happen. You approve contracts and expenditures at the council level. Understand that the mayor has no authority to speak for or bind the city contractually unless it's authorized by an ordinance or a contract approval. The mayor's authority is administrative, as is the city administrators. That authorization can be specific by approving a contract, or it can be general. Most cities understand that used to be, my example used to be in the distant past, that you bought a certain number of pencils every year. You know, in this year, in this era, you update your software contracts or buy a certain amount of gasoline for public works. And most cities understand that by use of the state small works roster, it's more effective. It's a more effective use of council time to authorize the mayor to approve contracts up to 50, 60, some thousands of dollars. You've established the general budget parameters, but allowing the city administrator and mayor to use tools to streamline that purchasing process where appropriate is an important part of that delegation of authority, but definitely a council prerogative. The relationship of the city with other entities, the mayor presides at your meeting. He's the ceremonial head of the city. One of my favorite, should military law ever be enacted, the mayor is going to direct the city forces there, and has the rights and privileges of a council member at a meeting. The mayor pro tem is typically appointed by the city council to serve in the mayor's absence. City council, you decide who will participate in governmental organizations, regional planning, health boards, those sorts of assignments. And you provide guidance to the mayor and other city representatives on those agencies. The city council may serve as, or members may serve as the city's representative as well. The mayor has a very limited legislative role. Obviously, the mayor's the chair of the meeting and exercises Robert Rules authority, but the mayor can only vote in a limited context, and it's the size of the box is defined by what he can't do. The mayor can't vote to pass an ordinance or break a tie to pass an ordinance, to grant or revoke a franchise or a license, or this is the statutory phrase, resolution for the payment of money. That is approval of payment in some of the various contexts that you use to approve the use of public funds. The mayor has a veto power over ordinances, which is where his exercise of authority comes in. He can do that directly or by a table veto, which can be overruled by a majority of the council plus one. So I want to see if we can apply some of these principles in a general context, or a specific context, pardon me. That right of inquiry, we've talked about it earlier, and I appreciate your discussion. It was very helpful to me. And in effect, I think we covered what I was trying to get at in this section, which is how does the council obtain necessary information without impairing your established priorities, those that you've established by planning, by the comprehensive plan, by zoning ordinances, by the budget and the TIP and CFP. And I'm not going to dwell on this because I think you had a good discussion earlier with items for follow-up. You need to follow the council or the path that the mayor has set to get that information. As we've said, don't approach city employees directly. Now, I say that understanding that you may have relationships with individuals. I'm not saying you can't socialize or discuss, but for formal gathering of information, use the process that's been established, and do not appear to have directed a city employee. Getting information, I would encourage this is a two-edged sword here, so I'm going to give you a horror story to indicate, again, I'm here at the request of your insurance authority or through them. The Association of Washington Cities and the Municipal Research Services Center provide great resources. By the way, I do this training through MRSC as well, in an abbreviated format. The those resources are helpful, but they provide general information. It can be helpful to you as a council member if you want to, for example, see what other cities are doing for everything from a small cell ordinance to flower basket programs or farmers markets. I mean, they can be a very good resource. Here's my horror story. This is a city manager form of government. This came up in training I did for the City Attorneys Association. This was an example that one of the attorneys brought up. Council member was dissatisfied with the city manager's performance, went to MRSC, got information on how to remove the city manager. At the end of the last council meeting in the year, made a motion to discharge the city manager. He had the vote set up. The council passed it. City manager was removed. What the council member missed by not consulting the city attorney was that the city manager had a contract, and with a provisions regarding discharge and a golden parachute. By the time it got sorted out, by not letting city administration, not using the city attorney for advice and understanding the structure, city ended up spending an extra $1 million to have the city manager leave 3 months early. So great information from MRSC and AWC, but make sure you share that information with fellow council members, and that where appropriate, and usually appropriate, make sure that your city attorney knows what you're doing so that he or she, he in your case, can help guide or make you aware of the sort of questions that MRSC won't ask you. How does that specifically apply in your community? Executive sessions are one of your most important tools for speaking frankly. One of the suggestions I always make is use them sparingly. The more you use executive sessions, the more your city citizens may believe that things are going on that they're not seeing. So be judicious in your use of executive session. One place that it can be very valuable is discussing the performance of a public official or qualifications of an applicant. You as council members will receive complaints from time to time. You will observe a portion of an individual's performance. An important way to provide feedback through the city administrator and mayor, if not directly as a council, is through the use of an executive session. Similar for complaints against a public official. It's a good way for you to understand the process. Let's assume that a citizen makes a complaint against a police officer regarding a traffic stop and you're interested. Understand that the mayor and police chief may be dealing with that issue already, likely are, that internal investigation procedures, a collective bargaining agreement, due process rights create a very tight structure for the mayor and police chief to operate through, and the city administrator. If you have questions, I'd strongly suggest that you take them up through the use of an executive session so that all the council can get the same information. Let the mayor, city administrator know that you're going to be asking for an executive session for that purpose, so that you can have the information you need available going in, and you can talk frankly about your concerns and understand what the process would be. In terms of complaints against public officials, understand that you have one opportunity to discuss the issue before the employee has to be notified. An employee or public official has the right after that first discussion to have any discussions taken place in public, meaning with them present. After that point, the individual has a right to be heard, and individuals and city employees have a federal name clearing hearing right. That is, if something negative is said about them that could affect their employability, think of it as libel or defamation, they have a right to a name clearing hearing. Again, this is one where use your city attorney, use your administrative structure so that you can understand how complaints are being dealt with. If you're concerned that they're not being dealt with in a timely fashion, or you have performance concerns, use executive sessions to channel that information to the city administrator and mayor. This is often one that gets comment. I'm going to pause for a second. Any council members have anything to say, or Mayor, Mr. Fox? Anybody, council members, any questions, comments? Okay. The budget's a living document. We've discussed intra-fund transfers. Where this often comes up, let's assume an overtime budget. Your city is burdened with, not burdened with, the realities of today that you have BLM demonstrations that require a significant overtime presence. That's been a reality for many cities in the past year. It may be necessary to make transfers within the general fund to cover that overtime, a very necessary expenditure. So that's an example of its use. You mentioned that you have a conservative use of your contingency funds. There are national standards for the cumulative totals. Sounds like that's something that you're well aware of. Interim approvals and the annual budget amendments. I find that one of the best tools for communication is to make council aware when things go awry or individual departmental budgets are going off their planned parameters. Do it early. If there's a change in a contract or a cost overrun, administration, again, the no surprise rule, let the council know. Make sure that the council knows at the relatively the same time. Pardon me, and get their sign off so that when that comes back as a budget amendment, you're not faced with the difficult and legally embarrassing situation of having the council fail to approve something that in effect has already been done. That leads to significant contract liability problems. As we've discussed, or I've discussed, frequently. Yes, ma'am.
Can I interrupt? Just a comment on that. So what happens? What is the city's position? What would be their path forward if council did not approve a budget line?
Budget amendment?
Yes.
Well, let's take a specific example. Assume you've got a cost overrun on a contract. It goes 20% over. The staff inform you through the city administrator, mayor at a council meeting. The council is asked, informed of the cost overrun, asked for authorization to spend money, again, a council authority. When that comes back, and a majority of the council approves it, I would hope that when that item comes back at in time for a budget amendment mid-year or year end, that it's pro forma, that there's no surprises. Or my dog's going to daycare here. Excuse us a second. Okay. One of the nice things about the pandemic is my dog lives under my desk, you know. So anyway, again, how could that, hopefully by using communication, you can avoid that. The council ultimately determines budget amendments. But if you'll remember, let me put a few things together for you. The mayor can make intra-fund adjustments. So the example I was using, cost overrun, mayor moves money from X budget to the public works budget to cover the cost overrun, informs the council in April that that's what he's doing. The council approves an additional expenditure, typically by voice motion. Again, that's that no surprise rule. By the time that matter comes back to you at the mid-year budget amendment or year end, it's not a surprise and you've already voted on it. Now, if the council goes sideways and you, for whatever reason, that's the city attorney's nightmare. I don't have an example there, except that you're going to be spending probably more money on legal fees than you would on having solved the problem.
Kathy Huber Nickerson, our finance director, has a question or a comment.
Just really quick, Scott, our city adopts the budget at a fund level, and so it's not at a line item level. Line item is not brought forth to council. So I just want to bring that to everyone's attention.
Good. Then you've gotten the latitude to be flexible. That still, though, I think it's still incumbent on the council, when the mayor's anticipating or can anticipate interfund transfers, to let the council know early. Because what you don't want to do is have mistrust develop and then have the council crank down the restrictions on that ability to make logical interfund transfers. So thank you. I appreciate that information that you can see. Again, ultimately, the budget is the council's tool. If you communicate and then the mayor, and there's trust, the mayor can use it flexibly, but that trust depends on early communication. Fair? Any other comments, Mayor? No.
Nope, thank you very much. No, doing great.
Job descriptions, confirmations of appointment. I mentioned this early. Again, given, yes, Ms. Burton.
I'm sorry, I just want to bring us back to that. You just mentioned the word trust. So one of the things that's critical for any functioning organization is a high level of trust, whether it's with the community, between the community and the council and the city staff, administrative, and one of the things that you and I discussed, and I'm sure others brought up too, is in 2019, seems so long ago, we had a bond issue which failed 90-10, unprecedented rate in the state of Washington. That was probably a kind of a culmination of lack of trust with the community. And I was disappointed as a council member that we, the greater we here, city administration staff, all of us didn't have a purposeful conversation about that. The key learnings, we did a little bit last year. Key learnings and how we were going to remedy it, which is a continuous process. In addition, we have a new mayor, new council dynamics, new city administrator. We were without one for almost a year. So unfortunately, we have a competent staff, and with the mayor they work through it and we're in a good spot. What have you seen in your work that is effective in making sure that we, as a city council administrative team, can build trust with our community and build trust with each other? The communication and constraints all work on that. You've pointed out that a number of times. There's always friction between different organizations. That's normal, but the amount of friction is definitely related to the trust that councils can add more constraints, which makes it less, the mayor not less effective because he or she can't be as agile as they need. So how can we do that? Build trust with our community and build trust with each other so we can have a stronger organization and a stronger community.
Well, thank you. I mean, the main focus of the presentation is on your communication. I think what you're pointing at is the need to bring the your citizenry into that discussion. I pointed out a number of places that it can occur, particularly in the comprehensive plan process. What is our community going to look like and how will it develop to understand what that plan is? That's a constant ongoing process. And using I keep talking about the TIP and the community's facility plan. But your hiring of a communications director is a good point. One of the failings of the statute, I don't say failings, the blind spot of the statute is it looks to public meeting processes. And I think we're all aware that the role of social media and has taken over a function of the public meeting. There's in effect a public forum going on as we speak every day, 24/7. So I think your use of a communications director to kind of bridge that gap, use those tools is a very thoughtful way forward.
And on that note, I just want to add in that we have 15 minutes left for this presentation. So there you go. I'm doing my job.
Yeah, there we go. I appreciate that. And I'll note that we started 10 minutes early, so I was winding up even faster. We mentioned confirmations and appointments. My strong suggestion is, given that the majority of your employees are tied to collective bargaining agreements, focus on key employees and understand that there are two separate tools. If you have a strong job description, that's often tied to the salary and the council's budgetary power. If you'd like more general authority, use confirmations. Anticipate change. We just covered that. I appreciate the finance director's information. And we've talked about line items. Personnel manual. This is different cities handle it different ways. The personnel manual itself really performs two functions. It provides work rules and direction to employees, which is an administrative function. It can also contain benefit information. That benefit information should be mirrored in your budget, in the annual salary ordinance, or that portion of the budget that deals with salaries and benefits. As the council, many cities bring a personnel manual back to the council for review or information, some for approval. I just wanted to emphasize from a statutory point of view that the direction of the workforce is an administrative function, and the mayor and city administrators right. That portion of any personnel manual is there for the council's information. If it affects the budget, it's your call. So it's always good. That's one of those communication tools. But when it comes to you understand what's there for your input and what's there for your information.
Can I ask a question on that one?
Yes, sir.
Did I hear you say that the work rules are the administration's job to create those? And
Yes, sir. Again, the mayor directs the day-to-day employees or functions of the city and its employees. And as a former, your former police chief, if I remember from the introduction.
no, that's the other one. He's
Yeah.
better looking than me.
Yeah, that as a certified city, those work rules are fairly well established through operating procedures. What I'm thinking about are how breaks are exercised. Again, and this is the overlap with collective bargaining agreements. So much of that is already covered. What I'm getting down to, I guess, is a suggestion to the council that you don't get down into the weeds about whether people have a 15-minute break, and who gets it. But you focus on the broader issues of how a benefit may impact the city. A good example is the discussions that are going on right now about whether some of the additional leave policies that were enacted last year with federal funding, whether they should be extended. That's one of those joint administrative council discussions because it's going to affect your budget.
That's what I was trying to drive at is at sooner or later that you're going to hit the policy area and it's going to add up to dollars as opposed to the administration just doing their job and making sure the employees are doing their job, which is way too far below where we ought to be involved. And so I guess in terms of policies, if I'm going to reword what you said, in terms of major policies, it would come to us for discussion. But in terms of work rules, it's their job.
That's the mayor's role. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
And finding in would that were a clear, bright line always. That's where communication comes in. This is I don't know, something that I've seen come up any number of times. Again, there's a much loved vacant lot in the city that's been used for years as a bird sanctuary. And a developer vests an application, let's say for a subdivision, and suddenly all that open space is about to disappear. And your phone starts to ring off the hook. I'm looking to you to talk because my voice is going here after 2 hours. How does a council member respond? How would you respond if a comprehensive plan amendment is proposed? Thoughts, council members?
I would begin by throwing it to the administration and saying, okay, what are we going to do with this in terms of where we stand currently and what we can do? And that would go through Jamal, I would think, to a guy named Phil, and they would start answering the questions and make suggestions. I wouldn't make a suggestion.
Okay. And I'll tell you, this is a bit of a trick question because the comp plan amendment is a legislative action of the council, and it's going to be part of your annual process. So that's one where there are multiple opportunities for public input. You're free, because this isn't quasi-judicial, to say what you darn well please to the citizen, direct them to the process. Your comment, Councilmember Hogan, is right on target, though, because by communicating with the city administration, you can get to the citizen what that comp plan process is going to be, when the public hearings will occur, steer them through the city's planning commission. So when that comes to the council for public hearing, in this context, as a legislator, you're free to talk. But it's important that you get the citizens into the process where they can be heard. This is Councilmember Burton's point about trust, is making sure that they understand where their input can occur. So let's tweak it a bit. You've got a rezone application for the entire neighborhood. Okay. I won't. You've been very attentive, and I appreciate it. So I won't trick you anymore. This is another legislative function of the council, and again, you're free to speak. This is a legislative action. Steer the individuals. Remember that under GMA, the application has to be consistent with the comp plan. So there are going to be set rules. You should be careful in that context to steer the individuals to the proper process to be heard, whether at the planning board or the council, and save your discussion for the council. Now, a rezone application, a site-specific rezone. Okay, we're tightening this down. That's one where it's going to come back. The rules will be different. A conditional use permit. And the trick here is that a conditional use permit will go to your hearing examiner. So you're back to being free to speak, not appear to bind the council, but that is, Councilmember Hogan, that is an excellent example of your comment about steering the comment to the city administrator, because the staff's going to issue the permit. There will be processes where the citizen can be heard, but ultimately it's going to end up at your hearing examiner for determination. One last topic, contract negotiation. And this is my strong recommendation that the executive starts every negotiation process, and I'm going to focus primarily here on collective bargaining agreements, that the council get council's input early in the process and get negotiating authority. By negotiating authority, that could be on publicly bid contracts. That's typically by ordinance. But collective bargaining agreements can be very touchy. Let's stay with collective bargaining agreements. The city has the obligation to negotiate in good faith. In order to negotiate by Public Employment Relations Commission rules, you need to have negotiating authority. You can't go to the table without something in your pocket. So I suggest that good contract negotiation begins with understanding what your negotiating parameters are. And much like the personnel manual and talking about it with Councilmember Hogan, that doesn't mean, again, I want to make sure that employees are at their desk by 8 o'clock every morning. It means typically that the settlement should be within broad budget parameters, X% or so many tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, so that your negotiating team goes into the discussion understanding what council expectations are. Continue that thought. The same rules tend to apply with legal settlements. Only the council can approve them. Since the council approves collective bargaining agreements and legal settlements, I mentioned this one earlier, it's important that, let's see if I've got the slide. Again, this no surprise rule. What you're trying to avoid is since the council has to approve the contract, a collective bargaining agreement, you want to be sure when it comes back to the council that there are no surprises, that you negotiate in good faith by, you can't back up in collective bargaining. that it's called retrograde bargaining. It's an unfair labor practice. Once money is on the table, you can't take it back. So having council negotiating authority going in so that when a contract comes back, it's what the council expects to see. You may not be happy with it, but you will at least have understood where it came from and have directed the process.
Can I ask a question on that one, Scott?
Please do, sir.
If the money's on the table and it can't be drawn back, can the money be shifted?
Absolutely. And that's, I do a lot of labor negotiations over the years, and moving deck chairs around on the deck of the Titanic is an important part of the process. When you get to the end and you're out of money, that is often how you reach resolution. And by the way, that in terms of communication, that's where having council understand what's on the table is very important. And typically, well, I've seen more PERC mediations in the past 2 or 3 years than I did in the previous 15. It's just after Janus, the U.S. Supreme Court ruling on that public employees, there's no obligation that they join a union. Union representatives have been far less cautionary. They hesitate to tell things like they are, in my opinion, and that means that you end up in mediation often. And so communicating with your negotiating team heading into the mediation process is important, as is reaching final resolution.
Thank you.
Scott,
Yes, ma'am.
it's Bonnie. And I think I'm going to lose the thought. Hopefully I got it. Is it possible for council to have a pre-meeting with our contract negotiators to be informed of potential items that will be introduced during those negotiations?
Sure. You can request that. I think it's good practice. Although, again, level of detail, council member. If it comes back to the budget and they're going to ask you to approve the contract, it's just good practice to make sure you're on board. And the technique that many negotiators use is you get initial bargaining authority and then come back to council as inevitably. What you're asking for is, so when do I go over the line? How close are my toes to the line the council set, and come back to the council and keep them informed. It's one of those two-way communication processes.